The 10th century, often called the Saeculum Obscurum, represents a period of deep crisis for the Catholic Church. Rome was a crossroads of political intrigues and power struggles between aristocratic families. In this turbulent context, the figure of the pontiff lost much of his spiritual authority. In the meantime, subscribe to the channel if you like these videos and leave a like. Now let's start. On the 14th of May in the year 964, Rome awoke to news that would forever mark the history of the papacy. Pope John XII had died in the early hours of the morning, not in the contemplation of prayer, but during an orgy in the Lateran Palace. According to witnesses, he suffered a stroke during an intimate encounter with the wife of one of his vassals. An unseemly end for a pontiff, but perfectly consistent with the dissolute life he had led. John XII, born Octavian in 937, was the son of Alberic II, a powerful prince of Rome who dominated both the temporal and spiritual power. From birth, Octavian was immersed in an environment marked by lust, corruption, and political intrigue. Raised without a true religious education, he was trained in the arts of manipulation, power, and seduction. When Alberic died in 954, he made the Roman clergy swear to elect his son pope at the first available opportunity. And so it happened. At only 17 years of age, Octavian became John XII, uniting in his hands the highest religious and political authorities of the Eternal City. His pontificate was immediately marked by scandals. John X did not see the papacy as a spiritual service, but as an opportunity to satisfy every desire. The Lateran Palace was transformed into a place of unbridled pleasures. Parties and orgies were held there, and it is said that the Pope had a personal court of concubines, including married women, widows, prostitutes, and even nuns. Famous is the testimony of Liutprand of Cremona, bishop and historian of the time, who tells how John celebrated Mass in the morning and in the same place presided over orgies at night. But sexual excesses were only a part of his moral decadence. John X sold ecclesiastical offices, used the Vatican treasury for bets and parties, and went so far as to use sacred relics as pledges in games of chance. He is said to have turned St. Peter's Basilica into a stable for his horses. His actions outraged even the most tolerant Roman nobles. The breaking point came when, after crowning Otto the Emperor in 961, John secretly betrayed him. Otto, known for his uncompromising morality, decided to intervene. He marched on Rome and convened a synod that, in 963, formally deposed the Pope, an almost unprecedented event. Giovanni fled to Tivoli, taking with him gold and lovers. From there, he tried to resist. When Otto temporarily left Rome, Giovanni returned with a mercenary army and took power by force. A wave of brutal revenge followed: torture, executions, mutilations against his opponents. His second reign was even more unbridled. The orgies became more frequent, the feasts more cruel. The boundaries between sacred and profane now completely dissolved. It was in this climate that, on May 14th, 964, during one of the umpteenth carnal encounters with Stephanetta, wife of one of his faithful, John XII collapsed, perhaps from a stroke. He died amidst the pleasures that had defined his life. Even his death became a symbol. Some tried to rewrite the events, hypothesizing a poisoning or a murder by a jealous husband, but the most accredited version remains that of a heart attack during the sexual act. His funeral was hasty and devoid of the solemn papal ceremonies. No one wanted to honor a man who had so deeply sullied the papacy. The pontificate of John XII represents the height of pornocracy, the secular and moral domination exercised by powerful Roman families over the church, often through corruption and moral degradation. His life is a warning of the dangers of absolute power when it is devoid of ethics. Modern historians hypothesize that John suffered from serious behavioral disorders, which today can be traced back to forms of pathological narcissism and compulsive paraphilias. His case highlights how, when spiritual institutions are bent to dynastic and political interests, they can produce figures wholly unfit for moral leadership. John XII transformed the Vatican into his personal playground, and his spectacular death was the tragic epilogue of an era in which the Church lost all ethical reference. It took decades of reform to try to rebuild some semblance of dignity and morality in the papacy. Yet the memory of that dissolute young pontiff remains as an eternal warning. Without moral responsibility, even the most sacred institutions are doomed to ruin. The pontificate of John XII represents one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. His rise to the papal throne, favored by dynastic interests and power games, was the symptom of an era in which the boundary between the sacred and the profane was not only blurred, but often ignored altogether. The Vatican of the 10th century, dominated by secular figures, manipulated by aristocratic families, and lacking an authentic spiritual guide, had become fertile ground for scandals, abuses, and debauchery. John XII was not only a young man overwhelmed by a power too great for his age and his morality, he was also the product of a rotten system in which sanctity was sold to the highest bidder and spirituality reduced to ceremonial ornament. His conduct, made up of sexual excesses, gratuitous violence, sacrileges, and political betrayals, was not an isolated exception, but the culmination of an institutional degeneration that lasted decades. His tragic and grotesque death, which occurred during an orgy in the heart of a papal palace, was not only the physical end of a dissolute man, it was a symbolic event, the perfect representation of the decadence into which the highest spiritual authority of Christianity had fallen. Dying in convulsions in the midst of an act that embodied the abuse of the sacred, transformed John XII into a negative icon, the personification of what happens when divine power is usurped by earthly ambitions. Yet, paradoxically, his existence served to shake consciences. After him, bishops, monks, and even sovereigns began to call for radical reforms, clearly perceiving that the salvation of the Church could no longer be separated from a moral refoundation. The following decades, though troubled, saw the dawn of a slow but inexorable process of renewal, culminating in the great reform movements of the following century. Today, after more than 1,000 years, John XII remains a figure who disturbs, scandalizes, but also admonishes. He is living proof of how corruption can creep in even in the most sacred places if power is exercised without ethical restraints and without awareness of one's spiritual role. His life and death teach us that authority, to be legitimate, it must always be founded on virtue, that religious prestige, when not accompanied by integrity, turns into a farce, and that every institution, even the most sacred, needs to be watched, reformed, and purified, lest it lose its soul. John XII was perhaps the worst pope in history, but his infamy served, paradoxically, as a watershed. His fall became the foundation on which others, more worthy, rebuilt the dignity of the papacy. And if history has value, it is not only in recounting the mistakes of the past, but in reminding us that no power is eternal, and that without justice, humility, and responsibility, even the highest thrones can collapse in the mud. That's all for today. And what do you think of this story? Let me know in the comments. See you next time. Bye.